So we're going to pick up where we left off, and with chapter 3 of my book called The First Shall Be Last. And really, that sort of got started as a result of looking at Amos 3:7, where God says that he's not going to do anything without telling his prophets first what he's going to do. So when we think about the last days, we see descriptions of the last days like this. It's going to be a time that has never been like it and never will be again. It's going to be one of the most significant times in all of human history. Never been anything like it. So I started to think about that. I'm going, okay, he tells us first that he's not going to do anything except he tells us first what he's going to do. And we keep seeing these references to the last days being so significant that there's never been a time like it. So with that being the case, do you really think he's going to leave us hanging concerning the details of the last days? Or is he going to tell us everything we need to know? Well, I come from the position that I believe he's going to tell us everything we need to know, and that he did tell us everything we need to know, including the identity of the Antichrist by name in the scriptures. And so we'll start with that. I believe that the scriptures beginning in Micah chapter 5, Matthew 24, Revelation 9, Revelation 13, and Revelation 17 tell you exactly, in a tremendous amount of detail, who the Antichrist is. But rather than going in the order I just listed, I'm going to work my way backward because it's easier to describe it this way. So, let's start with Revelation 17. Identifying the beast of Revelation. The beast that thou sawest, we all understand the beast is the Antichrist, right? Before we get started. Everybody agree? The beast is the Antichrist? The Antichrist is the beast? Okay. The beast that thou sawest was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit. Where does the beast come from? Open book test, right? Remember in school we used to have like geography open book test. Go, find the United States of America. And there's a map that says United States of America. Right here. Open book test. Where is he coming from? So he's not coming from Kenya? He's not coming from Hawaii? Says he's coming from the bottomless pit. Now, I've been a student of eschatology most of my adult life, and I've heard all kinds of things. Seems like every other president we have is a candidate for the Antichrist. Henry Kissinger is a candidate for the Antichrist. You know, Ahmadinejad's a candidate for the Antichrist. You know, there's the Mahdi. There's always somebody walking around the earth that, you know, his name adds up to 666, so he's got to be it, right? It says the beast comes from the bottomless pit. So that's where I'm going to look for the beast. And he'll go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. Stop. What happens to your name if you do not accept Yeshua as your Savior? What happens to it? It's blotted out of the book of life. That says to me it had to be there to begin with. How can you blot something out unless it was already there? It's my opinion that all of our names are written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, but we have to accept our reservation that was paid for us at the cross. If we don't, then our name gets blotted out. He paid the price. You know, when I was asked to come speak up here, somebody paid for our hotel room. All I had to do was walk up to the desk and tell them my name, and they said, yep, here's your key. Somebody paid for my reservation before I got here. All I had to do is confirm it. I believe it's the same way. When we accept Yeshua's sacrifice, the payment that he made for our admittance, if you will, into the kingdom, then great. But if you say, no, sorry, you know, thanks for paying for my hotel, but I don't want it. And they're like, wow, you know, we paid for everything for you. We did everything we could to get you here. Man, I'm sorry. Depart from me. You know. So who are these people whose names were never written then from the foundation of the world? It is my opinion, based on the research of Genesis chapter 6, that these are people who are never meant to exist in the first place. These may be hybrids. Abominations. If you look at the hybrids that were created in Genesis chapter 6, you saw that they were destined to utter destruction. Throughout the Torah, we read this. The Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, etc., etc., etc. Every time we encounter them, you see the words utterly destroy. And this is one of the things that trips up many people who don't understand what's going on in Genesis 6, and why many people become agnostics and atheists, because they can't accept this God of the Old Testament. Remember I said yesterday, many agnostics and atheists actually know the Bible better than we do? Yeah, because they read those things, they didn't understand what was going on, and they threw the book aside and said, this is crazy, this God is a genocidal maniac. Why would I want anything to do with him? Until you understand that he was wiping out abominations and it was an act of love to preserve his good creation from the evils of the bad creations. And Yeshua said in Matthew 24:37, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. Which means, if I take that literally, the last days are going to mirror the days of Noah. And if you keep reading, like in Luke, I believe it's 21, where he's talking, he says, except those days be shortened, no flesh would be saved. Something's going to happen, and it's going to be really bad, to the point where God's going to have to wipe the whole world out again, this time with fire, because of a repeat of what happened in Genesis chapter 6. What has been will be again, Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 1:9, right? So it is my opinion that these are probably hybrids. When they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. There's an interesting phrase right there. How is Yeshua referred to in the beginning of Revelation? The one who what? Was and... So the one who was and is to come. So this one's called the one who was and is not and yet is. Huh. Interesting. And here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads of the beast, remember the beast has 7 heads, right? Are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. A lot of people will stop there and say, see, it's the Vatican. Or they'll go off into 7 kingdoms, talking about kingdoms. Well, next sentence says there are 7 kings. Not talking about kingdoms there. Now, true, kings rule over kingdoms. That's true. But he's telling us to focus on individual people, not on kingdoms, though they may rule them. There are 7 kings. 5 of these individuals have fallen. 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and goeth into perdition. There's a ton of detail given in those few verses right there. So let's just go with the text here. It says we got 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. Okay. First thing we need to address again is that the word that was used there is kings. The Greek word is basileus. Strong's Concordance number 935 defined as a king, a ruler, an emperor. John did not use the closely related word basileia, Strong's Concordance number 932, which means kingship, sovereignty, rule over kingdom, etc. So all these teachers are out there saying it's seven kingdoms. That's not what the text says in English nor in Greek. It's talking about individuals we need to be looking at. So the 5 had fallen. Now, when I first started going down this line of thought, I had read a book by a guy named Peter Goodgame, who wrote a book called The Giza Discovery. This online for free. You can, I think it's thegizadiscovery.com or redmoonrising.com, I think is his website. Anyway, if you could just Google The Giza Discovery by Peter Goodgame. He was going down this same line of thought and put together a list of the people that he thought fit for the list of the 5 have fallen, 1 now is, and 1 is to come. And his list was based on, okay, if we know we're talking about the beast, we know we're talking about the antichrist, let's look for people in the biblical account and in history who fit antichrist-like characteristics. We know what the antichrist is going to do and some of his characteristics, so let's see how many people we could find that fit the bill, basically. And this was the list that he came up with, and as I did my own research, and again, I consider myself to be a researcher. By that I mean I research what has been searched by others before me. I don't take anything, and I don't want you to take anything that I say any more than I take anything somebody else says just as gospel truth. Take it, absorb it, write notes down, and go search it out for yourself, pray, and let the Holy Spirit be your teacher, not me or anybody else. So when I hear somebody give something that just kind of really resonates with me, I'm like, cool, okay, that's interesting. I'm going to go look it up and go search for myself. I found that I agreed with the list that he came up with a few exceptions that we'll cover. Number 1, Nimrod. He's the first king in the Bible, in the post-flood world, certainly. He's tried to create a one-world system without God. In fact, his goal was to kill God. That sounds a lot like the Antichrist. Look at what he's trying to do, New World Order. He's going to make war with the one coming on the horse. That we know that's Yeshua, so certainly fits. Pharaoh of Egypt at the time of the Exodus. This is something I recently stumbled across. There was a teaching done by Chuck Missler based on Isaiah 52:4, if I remember the address right. And he was basically saying that there's a very good likelihood, based on the wording of the text, that the Pharaoh at the time of the Exodus was an Assyrian. And what I find interesting about that is, if you look at the timeline, a lot of people will say that the Jews were slaves in Egypt for how many years? That's what everybody says, right? So Paul said, he set the guardrails up. Paul said from the giving of the covenant of Abraham until the giving of the Torah is 430 years. Nobody's in Egypt for 400 years during those guardrails. From the time of Abraham until Joseph is sold into slavery, other than a few trips there and back, but nobody's like spending time there, and certainly nobody's enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. From Abraham to Joseph is 215 years. So nobody's even in Egypt for 215 years. Then what happens? Joseph, he goes to prison, but he gets out, right? What happens next? Joseph is what? Made second in command of all of Egypt. So he's next to the Pharaoh. He's the guy, right? So, go a little bit forward from 215, and he's made, the second in command. And then the house of Jacob comes down, right, from Canaan. And then what happens then? Where do they go? Goshen. They're given like the best of the land of Egypt, and they're living like regional governors and princes in the land of Egypt. So now you're extending the timeline even further. Nobody's a slave yet. Best I can figure, they probably went into slavery right about the time of Moses' birth or very shortly before that. So 80 to 100 years max is all you can fit in the 430-year guardrail when you realize nobody's there until 215 and you progress that forward. So then a Pharaoh shows up that didn't remember Joseph. Well, how could that be if he was an Egyptian? National leaders, it's a good idea. You need to know your own history of the nation you're going to rule, right? Especially if you're coming of the people, for the people, by the people type of scenario, right? So if it's an Egyptian rising up through the ranks to become the next Pharaoh, he obviously would know about the other pharaohs in the history and Joseph, because it's not that far. I mean, we're talking maybe 100 years from the death of Joseph to the time that Moses is born. So Chuck Missler is talking about how, I think it says another Pharaoh, or whatever the word is used that precedes the Pharaoh, indicating a different person. He said the word is heteros, meaning of a different kind. A person of a different kind arose in the land of Egypt and became the Pharaoh and didn't know anything about Joseph. And so he put him into slavery. Now, Isaiah 52:4 says, "And thus saith the Lord God, my people went down afore into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause." And so he's got a whole teaching on that. I had never heard that before, but I'm like, well, that's absolutely fascinating, because one of the titles for the Antichrist is the Assyrian. We see that in Micah chapter 5 and elsewhere. There's a number of places it talks about the end-time tyrant as an Assyrian. So, and this guy, the pharaohs, of course, thought themselves to be a god, and they tried to wipe out God's people, right? So he's a good fit, definitely a good candidate for number 2. Number 3, Sennacherib, another Assyrian. Again, thinks himself a god, tries to wipe out God's people. Anybody know what happened to his army? Angel of the Lord came down and wiped out, it was 180,000 or something like that. I forget what the number was, but pretty much the whole army. And then he went home and his sons killed him. But if you think of Antichrist characteristics, he's a good fit. The king of Tyre, if you read about the description of the king of Tyre, it starts off describing him as a man, and all of a sudden the narrative kind of switches and starts talking about Lucifer, Satan. So clearly this guy had some kind of affiliation or likeness of the fallen one for that description to have been given. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes is not in our canonized text, although it depends on who you're talking about. If you're talking about the church that still has the Maccabees in their Bible, then it is canonized. Regardless, he's in in my current 66-book canon of Scripture, he's in the intertestament period. Those who still have the Apocrypha in their Bibles, it's part of their Bible. He came in there and was killing people, like, you better eat this pig or you die. So start eating pork or you're dead. Set up the statue of Zeus and offered up a pig in the temple, right? And Maccabees, I think it's 1 Maccabees 4, if I remember right, called that act the abomination of desolation. They defined the abomination of desolation as bringing a pig into the temple. And Sheila said, my wife said, wow, if the abomination of desolation was the bringing of a pig into the temple, what are we now? This is the temple of the Holy Spirit. The abomination of desolation, defined as the abomination of desolation, was bringing a pig into the temple. food for thought. Pardon the pun. Yeah. Something to think about. But, I mean, if you look at what he did, he's definitely a good candidate for an antichrist character. And I would suggest Alexander the Great may be another possible candidate. So I would take number 5 as interchangeable with either of those two guys as possibilities. Alexander the Great, of course, is in the canonized text of the 66 book canon. And he's described as what? What's the symbol used for him? Yeah, the he-goat. Yes, he's described as a he-goat, and he has a horn between his eyes. And it says the horn is the first king. Well, the first king of the Bible is Nimrod. So it appears, at least as I look at that Alexander the Great did whatever he did, at least in the likeness and the spirit of Nimrod. So he's a candidate, in my opinion. The one that now is, well, that depends on when you think is. Like Clinton said, right? Well, what's the definition of is? Well, it depends on when you think John wrote the book of Revelation. If it's an earlier writing or a later writing. I've heard good arguments on both sides. I tend to lean more towards the 90 AD viewpoint, but I've heard good arguments for the earlier, pre-destruction of the temple argument. Either way, you got two Caesars to choose from, Nero or Domitian. Neither one of these were good guys. I suspect Nero was probably worse than Domitian, but he had a burning candlelit dinners to the burning Christians and things like that. But the Caesars thought themselves to be gods, and they certainly persecuted God's people. So either one, again, would be a good candidate, in my opinion, for the one that now is at the time when John wrote those words. Now, the one that will come and his reign will be short, I think a reasonable case could be made for Adolf Hitler. Somebody in John's future reign for a short period of time, and he's done. I think people who lived during World War II, during the reign of Hitler, probably, I would think the most eschatology teachers at that time were probably looking at this guy saying, we're here. I know that if I was living in those days and knowing what was going on, I would have been having my eye on him for sure. So if this is a reasonable list, then let's continue with the descriptions given in the scriptures. We see that this individual has a deadly head wound, right? And I saw one of the heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And, a lot of people are saying it's Obama right now. And I will admit there is a lot of weirdness surrounding this guy. And I'll talk about him a little bit more as we get further in this presentation. I personally do not obviously believe that he is the Antichrist. I think he may be an Antichrist. There are many Antichrists. But there is the Antichrist beast that we're trying to nail down here. In my personal opinion, is he's probably playing the role of a John the Baptist type character, like others before him, preparing the way for what's to come. But, I joke about it, but I'm kind of serious. I don't really think the Antichrist is going to need a teleprompter to address sixth graders. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" I just can't see that applying to a dude that needs a teleprompter to read in front of sixth graders to give a speech. He doesn't impress me, put it that way. But if we look at the list, looking for somebody who has a deadly head wound, well, Nimrod, in numerous accounts of this character, he became known by many names. We talked about last night how at the Tower of Babel, everybody was under his leadership, all gathered together, and then the confounding of the languages. They went out to 70 different languages, 70 different people groups, went their different ways, talking about the same guy, now with different languages. So he took on different names. All right, but in the various stories of some of these names that he became known by, you'll see that he was chopped up. Osiris was chopped up into 14 pieces, only 13 of which were found. In numerous cases, you see the mutilation of this individual. The book of Joshua tells you that Esau cut off Nimrod's head. Esau was known as a mighty hunter, right? His dad loved him because he could bring home the venison, right? Remember the whole deal where Jacob fooled his dad, the whole deal with that. He was a good hunter. He was a teenager. He's about 15 years of age, I believe, 13 or 15, I forget, but I think he's 15. According to the Joshua account, he was out hunting Nimrod's pushing about 200 and change, 230, 215, something like that, years of age. He was known as a mighty hunter. He's out there, 2 alpha dogs in the same field. Esau waits in ambush and at the opportune time rushes out and cuts off Nimrod's head and kills his other 2 buddies that were with him. Meanwhile, Nimrod had a team of other people who were further away that heard the commotion, and they came running to see what was going on, found the dead body, and wanted to know who killed Nimrod, their king. Meanwhile, Esau had taken the coats that Nimrod wore that, according to Hebraic legend, were the original skins that God clothed Adam and Eve with, that were preserved on the ark and later went through Ham to Nimrod, according to the text. I think that that's where legends, like in the Greek mythology of the Golden Fleece, some of these stories find their origin in possibly a real event like that. So Esau takes off running. Where does he go? He goes home. He's starving after the battle, and this mighty hunter sells his birthright for a bowl of beans? When we read Genesis, that doesn't make any sense at all. This mighty hunter comes in, sells his birthright for a bowl of beans? What? But when you realize the subtext of what's going on from the elaborated story that we get in Joshua, well, it makes perfect sense. This guy's running for his life from Nimrod's buddies because he just killed the emperor of the world. He's like, what do I care about my birthright for? I'm a dead man anyway. Just give me something to eat. Well, all of a sudden that story makes a whole lot more sense. Right? So, according to the Hebraic text, he was killed by Esau. Now, there are rabbinic legends that say that Nimrod was killed by Shem. There's a number of possibilities of what could have happened there. I basically think that what happened after Esau killed him is that Shem chopped him up into the remaining pieces that we hear about in the Osiris legend, and the pieces were mailed out to people just same way, what's that, the prostitute, I think, in the book of Judges, I think, where she was chopped up and they mailed the pieces to people. They're making a statement, basically. But if you can imagine, Nimrod is the emperor of the world, right? And he's killed, and nobody's there to witness. Nobody saw what really happened. How many people do you think would be trying to take credit for getting rid of this guy? Try to prop themselves up as, I'm the guy. You know what I mean? So, interesting. Pharaoh of Egypt at the time of Exodus, he did not have a mortal head wound. Sennacherib, no. King of Tyre, no. Antiochus Epiphanes, no. Alexander the Great, no. Domitian, no. Nero, possibly. It is said that he stabbed himself in the throat. And by the Hebraic understanding, that may be considered part of the head. Okay, let's give it the benefit of the doubt. And according to the official historical narrative, Hitler supposedly shot himself in the head. Although recent forensic evidence disputes that, they found that skull was actually a female skull, and there's no real evidence at all that showed that Hitler killed himself. In fact, there's a lot more evidence that suggests he probably got away, made his way to Argentina or someplace like that. So, but for the sake of argument, let's just say we got 3 candidates right there. Well, as we mentioned already, one of the titles used for the Antichrist throughout the Old Testament is the Assyrian. Which one fits that title? Only one. Nimrod. So by process of elimination, we've landed on Nimrod. Now, one of the names Nimrod became known by was Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, there's a number of different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The way I look at Gilgamesh, I have a book on Sumerian myths and legends by Stephanie Daly, I think was the author, Cambridge, I think, Press. She was saying that it was understood that the Epic of Gilgamesh was a fictional story, what we might consider a blockbuster movie of the time. And a good orator, a king, if he's going on a long journey with his troops, they would hire, the local Shakespeare, somebody who could tell a good story, and they would entertain the troops, when they had their downtime. And a good narrator or a good orator knows his audience. And so they would embellish the story. Maybe even include the king that he's with as part of the story, or local legends, or whatever. He would tailor the story for the various people that he was telling the story to. And so you had different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So if you think of the Epic of Gilgamesh is like a blockbuster movie scenario, we could say, well, Harrison Ford is Han Solo. No, he's Indiana Jones. No, he's the President of the United States. No, he's a fugitive. Well, he's all of those things, right? One actor played many parts. So think of Gilgamesh as a fictional story in the Harrison Ford scenario, but instead of Harrison Ford, we're talking about Nimrod, right? One of the quotes from the Epic of Gilgamesh is, "Who can compare with him in kingliness? Who can say, like Gilgamesh, I am king?" Not exact, but pretty close to the same awe that people have reflected in Revelation 13. So there's a similarity there, but let's continue with this premise. Comparing Nimrod with Jesus, or Yeshua. Gilgamesh was said to be a God-man, right? We know that Yeshua is the son of man, but he's also the son of God, right? In the case of Gilgamesh, he's 1/3 man, 2/3 God. Well, 2/3 of 100 is what? 66.6%. 1/3 is what? 33.3%. 33 comes up an awful lot in occult circles and Freemasonry and secret societies, most of which the rituals go back to this guy right here. Osiris. He was one of the only other gods of antiquity besides our God, who was known as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords in the pyramid texts in the Book of the Dead, etc. Osiris, Mithra, Tammuz, these are various characters whose symbol was the cross. In this case, the Ankh, which actually predates the cross. The hoop of the Ankh represents resurrection. So there's this symbology already right there of a dying individual associated with a cross who rises from the dead. In numerous depictions of the various sun gods of antiquity, he's a dying and resurrecting figure. Apollo. In the case of Apollo, he's the son of God, the son of Zeus in that case. He rules from elsewhere. We know Yeshua is in heaven, right? We're his body here on earth. His head is in heaven. He's the head of the church, as it were. He is in heaven. His body's in heaven. Our body's here. We're the body. He's the head. In the occult, it's the exact opposite. It's the antithesis. You have the Horus and those who worship on the surface, and you have the Osiris, who's the ruler of the underworld. So it's an exact opposite in that scenario. We have the name of the Antichrist, the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit, given for us in Scripture in Revelation 9, verse 11. 9:11. Interesting. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit. Where did the beast come from? Okay. Whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon, which is a derivative spelling of Apollo. Same character. So it just told you who the Antichrist is. It's Apollo. And when you realize who Apollo is, and you start looking at the synchronicities of various mythologies, you realize, the Greeks are just borrowing from the Egyptians, who are borrowing from the Sumerians and the Babylonians, etc. And the Romans come along and borrow from the Greeks. Everybody's borrowing from each other, taking all of a sudden Zeus becomes Jupiter, and, they're taking the gods of those who came before them, renaming them in their own language and assigning attributes to them, and sometimes keeping the attributes borrowed from the other cultures. All right, so Apollo is the name of the Antichrist. 666, we all know about the number of the beast. We said that he was 1/3 man, right? Well, man is a carbon-based organism. The carbon molecule consists of 6 protons, 6 electrons, 6 neutrons. So just by default, man's number would be 666 by the carbon molecule. 2/3 God, 66.6. The Washington Monument represents a phallus. The obelisk in antiquity is a representation of the 14th piece of Osiris that was not found, that Isis fashioned in order to impregnate herself. So this is a disgusting object right here in our nation's capital, sticking up like a middle finger to God. And it's the largest phallic symbol in the world, standing at 6,666 inches tall by 666 inches wide at the base. When we talk about Nimrod, just by way of review, in my Teaching the Mythology and the Coming Great Deception DVD, these are just some of the names that he became known by. There are many more. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on the ones in red: Gilgamesh, Orion, Apollo, and Osiris. Because some very interesting things have happened in the last few decades. They found the tomb of Osiris in 1999. Dr. Zahi Hawass is one of the most renowned Egyptologists out there. He said, "I have found a shaft going 29 meters vertically down into the ground, exactly halfway between the Chevron pyramid and the Sphinx. At the bottom, which was filled with water, we have found a burial chamber with 4 pillars. In the middle is a large granite sarcophagus, which I expect to be the grave of Osiris, the god. I have been digging in Egypt's sand for more than 30 years, and up to date, this is the most exciting discovery I have made. This is what they found. Where the red star is between the middle pyramid and the Sphinx, that's where they found this opening. For years, they thought it was just a well, a watering well, because it was an opening, but it had water in it. And people would play in it or do stuff in it and whatever. For whatever reason, they decided, let's pump the water out and see what this thing really is. So they pumped the water out, went and found that it went down into this antechamber there, and they walked around, found another opening, and went down, and they found an area that had 6 sarcophagus and another opening, a 7th one. How many heads did the beast have? 7. 6 and 1, right? So you had 3 here, 4, 5, and you went down into the other one down here. So they went down there, and this is what they found. They found, this is an artist's rendition of what they found. Basically a square island that had water going around it, like a moat. They had 4 pillars on it that had writing on it that I suspect were instructions for how to use this chamber. And then you have another moat surrounding an island that had a very large, I think it was about 10 feet long sarcophagus. The lid was open and there was a body in it. So like the lid was ajar, it was off to the side, and they found a body in it. And everybody, after they examined it, determined this is not Osiris. Very likely it was somebody put into this chamber, probably with the hopes of being resurrected. Could this be a resurrection chamber, I think is the big question. And it didn't work, apparently. The person was still there.
We talk so much about dispelling myths. How about confirming one? What is this?
Susie, this is the tomb of Osiris.
The god of the underworld. This once extravagant mausoleum, a moat with 4 pillars engraved with hieroglyphics constructed thousands of years ago, was intended to be a shrine for the keeper of the afterlife.
So, flash forward a few years later, the tomb of Gilgamesh was found in April of 2003. And in this case, there was a body. And it was a very large body. And from all accounts that I had read and heard about this, the body was still very well preserved. I believe that Osiris was the very first mummy, the first person to be preserved through mummification.
Imagine the startling proposition that the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty men of old, the gods and children of the Watchers, could somehow rise up, could somehow be reconstituted inside of a body. And, of course, I've discussed with you before my theory that one of the greatest legends in history could be a record of that having actually happened. And I'm referring to Nimrod, who some scholars also identify as Gilgamesh of Sumerian fame, Apollo of Greek fame, Osiris of Egyptian fame. And this Gilgamesh was a giant who a lot of people didn't even believe was anything more than myth until his grave marker was found a few years back. And then, according to some people, the military swooped in and took possession and control of that dig.
Hey, Tom, I want to interject something. I talked to a special operations general who was there when Gilgamesh's remains, and his words were he was in a state of remarkable preservation, okay? He said they have Gilgamesh's remains. So if they have Gilgamesh and he is Nimrod, they got it. And the whole point was to extract the DNA.
And this body was pulled out of the desert sands of Iraq in April of 2003, coincidentally 1 month before we set up the military occupation phase. And the first thing our troops did was raid the Museum of Baghdad. 170,000 items were reported stolen, most of them returned. Of the 3,000 items that were not returned, they were cuneiform tablets and things related to resurrection and the afterlife. 1 month after finding this body, and apparently one of their primary goals was to extract DNA.
When the Iraqi regime fell in April 2003, the Iraqi Museum in Baghdad and museums in other provinces such as Mosul, Basra, and Babel were exposed to theft for 2 consecutive days. The theft was carried out by local and international networks as well as Iraqi and Arab agents. It is estimated that 170,000 artifacts were stolen, 15,000 of which have no registration records. The most important of these artifacts are the Sumerian cuneiforms, which represents the philosophy of life and death.
Many date back to Mesopotamian times, more than 4,000 years ago.
Artifacts pertaining to the civilizations of the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Chaldeans, and others that go back thousands of years in history. were taken away from the land of the two rivers.
In addition, entire book collections from certain historic eras disappeared from the National Library, thus negatively affecting Iraq's wealth of civilization and culture.
One must also mention that some artifacts were stolen and sent to Israel via the American forces.
American troops stood by as Iraq's heritage was plundered. One memorable moment that week was when Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld dismissed the looting in Baghdad as unimportant.
Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things.
Many of the looters knew which objects they were looking for and where to find them. In other words, they were insiders.
Investigations revealed that the main metal gate of the storage rooms was opened. It was not opened by force, which means a person who knew where the key was participated in the theft.
J.P. Morgan Chase Bank led a 13-bank consortium to establish the Central Bank of Iraq. De La Rue was brought in to print up the new Iraqi dinar. This currency has some of the most anti-counterfeit measures of any other currency on the planet, and yet it is completely worthless. Its current value is approximately 1,163 to $1 US. But from 1982 until about 1993, one dinar was worth $3.22.
There are secrets that George W. Bush guards at least as carefully as any entrusted to a president. Secrets he's forbidden to share even with the vice president. Secrets he's held ever since his days at Yale, where in his senior year, like his father and his grandfather, he belonged to Skull and Bones, the elite secret society whose members include some of the most powerful men of the 20th century. President Bush has tapped 5 fellow bonesmen to join his administration. Most recently, the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, William Donaldson, Skull and Bones, 1953. Bones is not restricted to Republicans. Yet another bonesman has his eye on the Oval Office. Senator John Kerry, Democrat, Skull and Bones, 1966.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us?
Not much, because it's a secret.
Is there a secret handshake? Is there a secret code?
I wish there were something secret I could manifest.
322, secret number?
There are all kinds of secrets, Tim, but one thing is not a secret. I disagree with this president's direction that he's taking the country. We can do a better job, and I intend to do it.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go
I'm
wild.
sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number 322?
First of all, he's not the nominee, and look, I look forward.
Are you prepared to lose?
No, I'm not going to lose.
Saddam
Hussein.
War and danger.
Continuing danger, hour of danger.
Very, very dangerous world.
The evil terrorists. 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 Terrorists.
Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists.
Terrorists.
Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorists.
Dramatic changes now beginning to occur. John Kerry with 77 electoral votes and George Bush with 66.
These men are like this. The only thing that unifies them are Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones will still keep control of the presidency.
By our efforts, we have lit a fire as well. A fire in the minds of men. It warms those who feel its power. It burns those who fight its progress. And one day, this untamed fire of freedom will reach the darkest corners of our world.
The Bible says that Iraq, which was known in the Bible days as Babylon, will not only emerge in the last days, it will emerge as the wealthiest, most peaceful, most powerful nation on the face of the planet. So the question is, how do we get from the chaos that there has been over the last few years to the wealthiest country on the planet in the last days? Something must get better.
Right.
So people ask me, are we making Iraq safe for the antichrist or safe for democracy? And it's a little bit of both.
We cannot continue to rely only on our military in order to achieve the national security objectives that we've set. We've got to have a civilian national security force that's just as powerful, just as strong, just as well funded. And those who tell us
that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. With profound gratitude and great humility, I accept your nomination for presidency of the United States. All across America, something is stirring. It's been a whirlwind of activity these first 100 days. Finally, I believe that my next 100 days will be so successful I will be able to complete them in 72 days. And on the 73rd day, I will rest.
What did the President and the Pope talk about this morning?
The Vatican positions, don't fall into the usual left and right of American politics. The Pope, for example, is for stronger world government, and he just issued an encyclical, a sort of Vatican position paper, calling for much stronger regulation of the financial world. And at the same time, of course, the Pope is opposed to abortion and stem cell research, which Mr. Obama favors.
E pluribus unum.
That was Latin. It's what's inscribed on a quarter.
Out of many, one.
Of course, the visual highlight was the president touring the pyramids, outside and in.
Purification, mummification.
Self-identification.
That looks like me. Look at those ears.
Separated at birth from a hieroglyphic, but the president's guide saw another resemblance.
Mr. President, you look like King Tut.
I've been told.
Yes, it's true.
He should know about King Tut. Dr. Sahi Hawass oversaw scans of Tut's mummy that produced this likeness. The president's trip inspired Egyptians to display decorations calling Obama the new King Tut of the world. But even the new King Tut couldn't budge a pyramid. Still, it's good practice for trying to push peace in the Mideast.
Scientists from all over the world are trying to figure out what caused a mysterious blue light to spiral in the sky over Norway on Wednesday.
Early yesterday morning, just before dawn, this appeared in the Norwegian sky. A blue light, small at first, growing into a spiral, and then disappearing into what appeared to be a black hole.
Thousands of Norwegians bombarded the Meteorological Institute to ask what that light could have possibly been. Some feared it could have been a meteor, others a black hole, and there are even those that thought it could be aliens.
December 21st, 2010, I looked up and I saw a decapitated blood red head, looked like, floating over the shoulders of Orion at 2:22 in the morning. Oh, by the way, 2:22 in the morning Central Standard Time is 3:22 in the morning Eastern Standard Time. 322 is the coveted number of the Skull and Bone Society, of which the whole Bush family has been strongly associated with, as was Kerry. Two Illuminists, 322. What's that? A skull? A decapitated head on top of a pile of bones? 322. What was happening in Iraq at that very moment? Iraq had just announced the foundation of its newly formed government. And the entire planet, you could look this up for yourself, shook. The seismographic monitors that check earthquake activity around the world, every one of them went into the black that night. What's going on? I don't know.
After nearly 9 years, our war in Iraq ends this month. Today I'm proud to welcome Prime Minister Maliki, the elected leader of a sovereign, self-reliant, and democratic Iraq. In the coming years, it's estimated that Iraq's economy will grow even faster than China's or India's.
Here's my dinars. I got them.
Well, look,
I'm from the Trade Bank of Iraq, the only ATM in the country.
Look, this is a country that's resource-based, that obviously has tremendous aid by the U.S., but could be very self-sufficient with all these oil companies that we've been talking about that are exploring, they're about to explore there. And so I told my viewer, look, I can't fight it. I would like to know how best to get it, and it would really be great if these guys set up these ETFs all the time. How about an ETF to play the dinar? That would really be the best way to go.
For the first time in 2 decades, Iraq is scheduled to host the next Arab League summit, and what a powerful message that will send throughout the Arab world. And finally, we're partnering for regional security. For just as Iraq has pledged not to interfere in other nations must not interfere in Iraq. Iraq's sovereignty must be respected. And let us never forget those who gave us this chance. The untold number of Iraqis who've given their lives. More than 1 million Americans, military and civilian, who have served in Iraq. Nearly 4,500 fallen Americans gave their last full measure of devotion. Tens of thousands of wounded warriors, and so many aspiring military families.
People ask me, are we making Iraq safe for the antichrist or safe for democracy? And it's a little bit of both.
This is an extraordinary achievement. Nearly 9 years in the making. We're building a new partnership between our nations.
America continues to maintain a high presence in the country, with the largest U.S. embassy in the world located in the capital Baghdad, with 15,000 members of staff.
Before they leave, U.S. forces will have to transfer dozens of bases to the Iraqis and dispose of or ship out thousands of vehicles.
Sometimes it's too cumbersome to bring a lot of this equipment back to the U.S., so a lot of it's left on bases. We're leaving over 500 military bases to the Iraqis, both to the Iraqi security forces and also to the government.
This is a happy occasion for all of us. It is considered one of the most important days for the Iraqi army and Iraqis, which is the day of handing over Sania base from the friendly side to the Iraqi army.